Welcome. We are so happy you were able to join us for today's talk. My name is Marta Rose, and I will be moderating our webinar on race, racial justice, and Indigenous language revitalization in applied linguistics. Before we begin, we would like to thank the Committee for Online Education and Outreach for organizing this webinar, our speakers, and the leadership at AAAL for making today's discussion possible. We would also like to thank Cambridge University Press and the Annual Review for Applied Linguistics for making the articles featured in today's talk open access so that we can widely disseminate this work. As a field, we will need to make conscious choices as we move forward, and today's conversation is one small step in that direction. We will begin our webinar with a statement from AAAL's Executive Committee. Dr. Kendall King, AAAL President, and Dr. Fabiola Eller-Zavala, AAAL Secretary, will speak. We will then hear from our three presenters. Dr. Uju Anya from the Pennsylvania State University will speak about engaging African Americans in world language study. Dr. Nala McIver from the University of Victoria will speak on the importance of strengthening the connections between Indigenous language revitalization and the field of applied linguistics. And Dr. Suhanti Motha from the University of Washington will speak on whether it is possible for applied linguists to be anti-racist and decolonizing. You will be able to submit questions using the Q&A feature. You'll also be able to upvote questions, so we're hoping that that allows it to be a more interactive experience. And we will address questions during the second half of the webinar after everyone speaks. Questions can be submitted at any time. And now let's begin with a statement from AAAL's Executive Committee.
Hello, greetings from Minneapolis, and welcome and thank you for joining us for this special summer session showcasing recent ARAL publications. A really warm thank you to our participants for providing this chance to engage with their very important academic work, and to the Committee on Online Education and Outreach for organizing this, and to Marta in particular for moderating and doing the tech and so much more. Thanks also to Allison Mackey, editor of ARAL, for putting this issue together and for coordinating the open access to the publications. For AAAL's Executive Committee, as I'm sure for many AAAL members, the awful events of the last 6 weeks have been cause for reflection and renewed commitment to do and to support work that contributes to greater equity, to anti-racist policies and practices. As Dr. Anya closes her article, let us do better. One way we can contribute to addressing injustices is by listening, learning, supporting, and advocating for Black communities, Indigenous communities, and communities of color who continue to experience the damaging effects of historical trauma, oppression, systematic racism. Indeed, Dr. McIver's paper that we're going to hear more about today is in some ways, in her words, a call for greater collaboration and an invitation to learn from one another. And many of us in AAAL are deeply committed to using our skills as scholars, as researchers, and teachers to that end. We are also aware that words alone are insufficient. Much more work needs to be done to combat injustice in all of its forms and to understand how race and racism is interwoven with our field's development and its current practices. As Dr. Motha suggests, this entails considering how our research methods, for instance, have played a guiding role in reinscribing whiteness in much of the field of applied linguistics. The EC is deeply committed to that work and for several years has engaged in reflection and action to that end. So furthering these efforts, I'd like to call your attention to two additional upcoming summer sessions. On Wednesday, August 5th, the Public Affairs and Engagement Committee will be hosting a panel on applied linguistics in the public realm. And on Friday, August 28th, the Executive Committee will be hosting an interactive open forum to share with membership recent EC equity-oriented projects and activities, and to hold a membership-wide dialogue on additional steps and priorities going forward. So we welcome and encourage your participation in both of these events, and they'll be widely publicized in the weeks ahead. So thank you again, and I will now turn things over to my EC colleague, Fabiola.
Thanks, Kendall. Hello, everyone. First and foremost, I would like to second all the sentiments just expressed by Kendall, and I would also like to take the opportunity to expand on the Executive Committee's message regarding AAAL's position on the matters that are our priority. AAAL is deeply committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. And this is not just a rhetorical exercise for the EC. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, to which I'll refer here as DEIA, are values that we fully embrace and that are part of our guiding principles as we continue to shape our organization, always a work in progress. We know full well that our members are situated at various points of this DEIA conversation, as we are all at different stages in our professional careers. Therefore, as a committee, the EC is working on striking a balance in making progress to ensure that AAAL is an organization that lives its values and priorities as opposed to an organization that just talks about them. We want to ensure that we can fully support our members wherever they may find themselves on this continuum. Some will need more information on what has been done within AAAL and beyond our organization, as in order to start solving a problem, one needs to understand it. As some leaders from the Racial and Equity Institute, such as Monica Walker and Rainey Lean, just recently have pointed out. Others may be ready to move on to the next step, which is moving from data collection and interpretation of, for example, racist issues to engaging in action for change. For those of us that are in this space, ready to move on to the action stage, the question oftentimes is how? How do we do it? And as we know, and was recently reinforced by Professor Ryoko Kubota during her presentation following the receipt of her AAAL Award for Distinguished Scholarship and Service, the answer is not easy, and we welcome ideas. As an organization, as I anticipate you will agree with me, we have simply not quite cracked the code, but we are making progress through the skills and expertise our members contribute, whether it is through research, education, administration, and or service. In moving forward, what are some of the needs that we as an organization have? Some of us who come from a minority background, such as myself, do need the support and help coming from others in this journey to change the narrative and the actions of AAAL. We actually need the help of the vast majority of our members who are in the majority. And we're working towards creating the space so that we may hear from more AAAL members in this regard. That is the goal behind the upcoming interactive open forum the EC will host, as Kendall mentioned earlier. We also need to do a better job in measuring our progress. But first, we need a plan that can be subjected to being measured. Accountability in the end matters. In engaging in this type of work, we will also accept the fact that we may need to feel uncomfortable, and at times very uncomfortable. As you can see, the future is not easy, but no one said it would be. As AAAL moves towards changing the larger narrative and an action plan for both within our organization and in our society, challenging the status quo, dismantling systems of historical oppression, and rebuilding for a better future, we need to be both perseverant and resilient. As I believe I said in my oral report to the membership in March of 2019 during the general business meeting in my role as secretary, we didn't get here in one day. We won't get where we're going in one day either. The future, however, is ours to craft. Let's work together to paint the best possible picture for the future generations to come. Together, we can do it. As we have our own expertise to contribute during this collective journey, whether it is, as I said earlier, as students, administrators, educators, scholars, or a combination of these. Now, let's turn our attention to our colleagues whose work will address some of the points I've signaled in my remarks. Thank you for your attention, and off to Marda.
Okay, then it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Anya to speak. Here you go.
Thank you very much for the invitation to join here and to talk about my contribution to AREL's 40th anniversary issue. In this article, I present inquiry on the participation of African Americans in the academic study of world languages, and I examine the impact of race in language learning through the experiences of Black students in language education and study abroad. I want to make clear that in terms of cognitive processes, the universal endowments, we all have, I don't make any case that Blacks learn languages any differently than anyone else. This would insinuate that our brains are somehow wired differently, or that there would be a biological case to be made for racial differences. We all know the biological interpretation of races is false. We also know that race is very sociologically real. And we clearly see racism and racialized hierarchies and their material impact in all our lives, our societies, and institutions. Language learning is no different from any of these realities. And the individuality of the Black experience makes for very unique sociocultural and sociolinguistic perspectives in language learning. And we should really take all this into consideration if we seek to address the problem. And the problem is the underrepresentation of African Americans as students, as instructors, as researchers, and as principal study populations in the field of world languages. So we have this problem of low rates of participation and advancement of Black students in our world language programs. And we see them at beginner levels, but they don't continue on to the advanced. And this is not due to any sort of inherent deficits that they may have, or even a lack of desire or lower motivation to study languages in comparison to anybody else. This is due to racism. And the African American underrepresentation in world languages comes from a history of systemic exclusion and marginalization in US education as a whole. And Black students at the K through 12 level, they're more likely to attend schools or be tracked into programs where world languages aren't available for them. The schools that they typically will attend map onto broader indexes of socioeconomic disparities in neighborhoods and districts. They're struggling, these schools, for funding for language programs. In the schools that Blacks are where they do offer languages, we see systemic problems of African Americans being placed into tracks without language study. And we see clearly institutional gatekeepers like teachers and counselors and administrators that keep them out of prestige programs like dual language immersion and study abroad. So the research, a little bit of research that we do have on African Americans in world language show that the high school students and the college students are motivated, and they do hold positive attitudes towards learning new languages. But even the instructional environments in the classrooms themselves, they report as being poor, unfavorable, with racist teacher and classmate attitudes, and unfavorable perceptions of them, low expectations. And the very key complaint that they make of curriculum and materials that they deem very unappealing to their interests, their cultural identities, and basically irrelevant to who they are and what they hold dear. And so since we don't have Black students coming up in the K through 12 pipeline onto the college level, African American scholars are also missing in applied linguistics and second language acquisition research, and our community, as we said. This means that we're not producing research on the experiences and differences and concerns, particular concerns of Black people in new language learning, because typically Black language program graduates are the ones that are going to become educators and scholars, and they're more likely to choose African Americans as research participants, greater access, understanding, affinity, and also the scholars we know, in general, everyone, Black, white, otherwise, will recruit participants from their own programs or similar programs and institutions, and Black people ain't there. So we just, we can't also just blame the scant research on African Americans and world language study on this broken academic pipeline that I talked about. It can also be traced to the work that we do, right? The dominant theoretical orientations of applied linguistics and SLA that are still examining language as some sort of entity or phenomenon that can be separated from the people who are doing the languaging. We also know that applied linguistics does not take seriously enough the work of those of us who look at ethnicity, gender, class, sexuality, and how other social identities impact language learning experiences. And we definitely have yet to make a meaningful reckoning of race in SLA. So, and this also can be attributed to the fact that our field continues to resist against openly addressing, racism, xenophobia, colonialism, which are uncomfortable topics that arise when you're looking at the experiences of racialized and minoritized groups in language learning. But there is a little bit of research out there, and I can tell you, from this research what we know. We know that race matters in new language learning, and we know that racism impacts everybody's experiences in our programs and our institutions, be they beneficiary of racism, or be they suffering under racist oppression. We know systemic racism has contributed to the exclusion of African Americans from classrooms, from special language programs, from inquiry and the pipeline. We also know that early language study, language immersion, for example, boosts African American students' performance in other content areas. However, stigma, especially stigma against African American language, and the way, the heritage speaking traditions of African Americans, and deficit ideas that Blacks do not do well, for example, in immersion programs because they're struggling enough already speaking English. These ideas still persist. And these are some of the reasons why the gatekeepers will say that they don't want to burden Black students with additional challenges that they supposedly can't meet and exclude them from programs like immersion. We also know that racism in local communities and study abroad critically affect Black students' interaction and participation in those communities. Where they experience racist, sexist, sexual harassment, being targeted by the police, refusal of service, hostility from locals. We know that this is interfering with their ability to fully participate in those communities, thus directly impacting language learning. And we, as I said before, Black students are reporting dissatisfaction with what's going on in the classrooms as not being interesting, appealing, and relevant. And we also know on the flip side that when you do make the effort, right, to create programs and curriculum where Black students' identities and experiences are valued and Afro-descendant populations and cultures are included in the curriculum and in the programming. And we know that African-American students will then develop strong linguistic expertise, make clear, appreciative, communicative gains, because they're experiencing and participating and learning and in target language communities where they feel connected, comfortable, relaxed, and respected. So how do we address these problems? Well, first of all, a color evasive approach to language learning research and language teaching is harmful. We have to abandon this idea that applied linguistics or our field of world languages is somehow race neutral, and these are not concerns that we should have in our field. If we don't acknowledge that people are having different racialized experiences, we can never recognize and solve problems caused by racism. Right? Our field is not race neutral. Applied linguistics research is not race neutral. We talk about race and racialized identities every single day. We see this in the identities that we focus on and in the ones we ignore. And these tend to go, according to patterns of, our societal white supremacy. So we need more studies on Black students' experiences at all levels, especially elementary and middle secondary levels. We also need more studies on immersion, which has been shown to provide strong, social cognitive benefits across all groups. And this is also where we see the lowest level of Black student access and participation. We need training for teachers and counselors to address their roles in the gatekeeping that excludes African Americans from beneficial language learning opportunities, and to help these professionals learn about Black students' instructional experiences and the myths and the deficit mindsets about their abilities in language learning, and the strategies to promote more equitable participation and success for this group. We also need much more public outreach to Black parents on the benefits and opportunities for their children in world language study. Black students really express this desire to see more relevant and personally significant connections made between their experiences and those of the cultures and the people who speak the languages they study. And we should work harder, much harder for this. And study abroad, advertising, outreach really needs to be much better targeted, and locations chosen to appeal more to this population. And regular orientation should be a part of study abroad to address racism in host countries and among groups and participants themselves. In general, all language programs should orient staff and instructors on facilitating safe and supportive spaces in classrooms for experiences with racism to be discussed. Racism doesn't exist outside of our classrooms because we don't exist entirely in this classroom space. I would like to, as my final word, put out a special call for more second language acquisition work, examining language learning processes at the interactional level through in-depth and holistic explorations of African American experiences. We need this for theory generation, and we need it to support classroom instructors in building the skills to address Black students' complaints of their experiences being tiresome, unappealing, and culturally irrelevant. And finally, in line with what we're seeing that's happening lately, right, that's seeing this in our field, this social justice turn, we need more research that directly names racism and addresses racism in the field of second language acquisition, because the problem of African American underrepresentation in our programs will not be solved by ignoring its major cause. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Uju. That was wonderful. And it gives us a lot to talk about and think about. We're already getting some questions in the Q&A and some really good conversation in the chat. And if we could keep the questions in the Q&A, that'll make the next part of the webinar easier. Thank you. Okay, so now I invite Dr. Anawa McIver to speak.
Tanse. Managing multiple technologies here. Tanse kidawao, unawa ni sikastun, kinosio sipi o chinida, lakwangan iguas and chathan aski newigan. Ekse. Welcome to all of you, Tawao. It's wonderful to be with you today. I've just said to you in my language, hello, how are you? My name is Onawa McIver. I am coming to you today. My family is from Fish River, is what the translation into English is. The area in Canada is known as Northern Manitoba. And I'm coming to you today from Lekwungen and Sinchothan speaking territories, which is in Southern Vancouver Island in British Columbia. Myself and my family, we're uninvited visitors here on unceded territories. The people's relationship continue to this day, to this land. And my relationship to those people is an important part of the work that I do in language revitalization. I also want to begin not only to thank the organizers, but to start with an acknowledgement of one of my teachers, Dr. Patricia Duff, known affectionately to most of you as Patsy. She was one of my supervisors at UBC way back in my doctoral days. And if it wasn't for Patsy, I wouldn't be here with you today. She really was my bridge into this world. She introduced the world of applied linguistics to me, and it really cracked open Fabiola said, you know, crack the code. It really opened a whole new world to me. And really the foundation of this paper was the beginning of the learning that I did with Patsy way back then. So I raise my hands and say, can I ask someone to Patsy for really being the person that was that bridge. So I thank Patsy for that. So what I wanted to share with you today is just some thoughts stemming from the paper that I wrote, but I'll try to extend that a little bit for you today. So a lot of the conversation today, as I see it, is centered around AAAL as an organization. It's the kind of basket that's organized this talk, but it really, that organization represents something, which is a community of scholars and practitioners who are all interested, have a common interest in language learning and teaching, or the effects of these activities on humans and human communities. Some of us, a lot of us, have a particular interest in marginalized or minority language communities and the continuation of those languages in meaningful ways. And so that's really the overlap area for the work that I do and what I'm be talking with you about today. So in my paper, I made an argument for Indigenous language revitalization as a distinct field of study. It has a particular aim, it has a particular group of constituents, and it has a developing group of pedagogies, arguably. But there's overlap and interplay with various sectors of the scholarly field of applied linguistics. And I know that the container of applied linguistics is enormous as well. And so I use that in the most respectful way possible. And I know that I can't capture all of your work perfectly. So my interest is really in finding the common ground between the two fields. So for me, I think of them as sort of two concentric circles. So not everybody in the whole field of applied linguistics will be interested in knowing about Indigenous language revitalization or working in that area. And the same is true for Indigenous language revitalization. I encounter some of my colleagues that have an aversion to anything that feels like it has a colonial feel to it, or it's anything that's kind of outside of our communities or is beyond something that's self-determined or has a sovereign aim to it. But my interest is the space in between. The scholars, those of you practitioners and academics who have an interest in the shared space. And there are people on both sides, and I know that many of you are on the call today and will be watching this. So the argument that I've made is that I think that we have valuable knowledge and insights to learn from one another. So it's an opportunity for a true partnership, in the sense that it's not just one field that holds a whole bunch of important information that the other field needs, nor the reverse. So it can't be an extractive relationship, but rather a relationship for the possibility of something that could be built together that we could learn from each other. So I wanted to just share an example with you. So our fields of practice are vast, but one of the areas that I'm working most deeply in right now is adult language learning. So one of the areas in our field that we've done a tremendous amount of work in the past 20, 30 years is in adult immersion programs. And this is because of the history in all parts of North America around Indigenous language, where adults, there's a gap really in our communities with our elderly people being speakers of the language, a lot of language programs focusing on children, understandably so, but then we have this gap of adults who don't speak the language. So the kinds of practice work and research that we've had to do around that really is around efficiency and efficacy. We have researchers who are looking at how many thousands of hours does it require to bring people to conversational level if you're using ACTFL levels of assessment to get to intermediate, high intermediate, and condensed periods. You know, what length of period of time does it take in order to have these sort of adequate proficient speakers who ultimately then can teach other people. And so this is an area of, these are areas of research that have long since been explored in parts of applied linguistics. But within that, there's also deep explorations around pedagogical tools. Which ones are the right tools? Which ones are the best tools for each context? And then also measurements. So how do we measure if the efforts that we're making are working well? How do we know? We don't want another 30 years to go by and then know that those efforts were not the right efforts. So the call to action, as Kendall put it, for the crossover between our two fields is really about maximizing resources around sharing our skills. And one of the things that's very particular to the field of language revitalization is that we don't have time to waste. So it's one of the epistemological foundations of our field is that we are always focused on saving time and energy while we advance knowledge. It's one of the necessities of our field that's quite particular. We don't have endless amounts of time to continue studying and thinking about this and thinking about that because of the realities of the demographics of our field. I'll shift just in the last part of my talk to think about some more recent events. Of course, the responses that we've all had to have to COVID-19, but the effects that that's had in our field. So the work that we do in language revitalization is largely, although not exclusively, territorially based, often face-to-face, often done with groups of people, and often done with elderly people or older people in our community. And like all of us, we've had to shift to this online reality, to online connection. But what we've found in our field is that there's a necessity for the work to continue. So how do we find ways for that work to continue? But with the particular reality that most of our teachers, most of our knowledge holders are elderly. So the crossover to using technology is more difficult that way. And why I bring that forward to you is that it's a living example that our field right now is investing heavily in solutions and innovations. And I wonder if some of you might be too. I've also launched a new research study and we're putting forward another grant for the fall. So we have one already and another one coming forward studying these effects. And I wonder if some of you might be too, as another example of the crossover. So to end then with solutions, where do we go from here? What does this all mean and what are the possibilities for this crossover, for the creating space? What does it mean to create space in communities like ours? The number one thing that I would say is that we need to create and increase capacity with Indigenous scholars. So I'm one of a handful of Indigenous scholars that exist in Canada. I would say probably 10-ish, and there's probably about the same number in the United States. So those of you who are in faculty positions, one thing that you can do is champion Indigenous students in PhD programs to become scholars of Indigenous language revitalization and learn about applied linguistics like Patsy did. I'm here because of Patsy, in part. Number two, for those of you who are not in faculty positions, to more greatly inform yourself of these issues. So similarly to something that Fabiola said about the work of AAAL-EC, we didn't get into this situation by ourselves. This was a shared endeavor. We didn't create this situation for ourselves with Indigenous language, the deficit that we're in with our languages. And we need everyone to help in a way to get out of the situation. And wherever you are, and I don't know if you have international members here, but everywhere that you are in the world is somebody's territory. So taking the responsibility to learn about the land beneath your feet. And the last thing that I would say, having been to a few AAAL conferences myself and sitting on a few panels there, there's very, very few Indigenous people that engage in those spaces. I've had the privilege of having some private conversations with folks about that, how that experience has been for them. And I would just reflect on an author that I've been reading this summer, some pleasure reading that I've been doing. And it was just a good reminder that we talk about circles, circles of friends, circles of communities of practice. And one thing that she writes about is, let's make sure that our circles are actually horseshoes, and that we make sure that there's an opening there, and that we don't just talk to say, hi friend, so good to see you, but make sure that we actually create an opening. And so I'm quite open to being a part of that solution for you if that's of interest to the group. Hi, hi.
Thank you. That again, I have so many questions, but I have to hold back because I'm the moderator. And now I'll invite Dr. Suhanti Motha to offer her words.
I was muted, so sorry. And thank you so much. I want to contextualize this talk by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from Coast Salish lands. I'm on the unceded lands of the Duwamish tribe. My University of Washington campus in Seattle and also my home sit on the lands of the Duwamish tribe, who don't receive federal recognition. In 1855, in the Point Elliott Treaty, they were promised land and healthcare and educational rights and fishing rights, which are really important in Western Washington, but these haven't been delivered. So to this day, the Duwamish don't have just access to their homelands. And as you sit and watch this webinar, I wonder if you're on Indigenous land, and if so, I invite you to speak the name of the rightful inhabitants of the land that you're on, and maybe type that name into the chat function and share with the others on this call. So the settler conditions on which we gather necessarily raise questions about the connections between historical and contemporary atrocities against Indigenous people here and globally, and also connections to violence committed against other marginalized communities. And it begs the question of what it means for us to be here on this land and practicing knowledge systems such as the construction of academic knowledge, including applied linguistics, right, in the context of the history of this land. It's very complicated then to talk about gratitude for what we have here at this moment. And I don't know how to reconcile being both horrified by the past and thankful for the chance for us to gather here and now. And I only have 10 minutes, but I'm following my instinct and pausing to give thanks, and thinking that even when we're in a hurry, it's more important than ever during this challenging period. So I just want to give thanks to all of those who helped us to arrive here at this moment. Martha, Kendall, Fabiola, Nelson Flores, Eve Hawk, Allison Mackey, the sister scholars. You can never do this work alone. And I'm really honored to be sharing space with my co-conspirators, Uju and Anawa. So my article in this issue is quite short. It's just 5 pages. And it was originally a AAAL plenary. It was aimed at a very general audience. So I'm hoping that it's an easy and accessible read. I was thinking about people in the room who might be new to the conversation when I wrote it. The question that the article is wrapped around is simply, is an anti-racist and decolonizing applied linguistics possible? And it really rose out of my own reservations about my participation in the project of applied linguistics. I've been thinking about the fact that around the globe, health and safety and wealth and opportunity are all really inequitably shared along lines of race, and that the ravages of colonization feel so recent and its afterlife so lasting. And I've been thinking about the complicated and significant and yet really invisible role that applied linguistics as a field is playing, right, in ensuring that these dynamics remain true. And so I've been asking myself, you know, what role do I play in all of this? Is my work doing good? Are we doing good as applied linguists? How do we want our work to shape the world? In the middle of a lot of global crisis, right? You have these existential questions. So how do I want to be spending my life? And am I going to be able to do that work within this discipline as it's currently configured? So I open my article with a story from my doc student days about someone who's trying to claim an objective applied linguistics. You know, you've all heard a version of that line, like, what does this have to do with linguistics? What does this have to do with language? As though it's possible for language to function in a way that's somehow impervious to the effects of racial hierarchies and racial violence and anti-Blackness and xenophobia and concerns about language rights and language loss. This version of a detached applied linguistics is, you know, I think a fantasy, and it relies on a race neutrality in which whiteness becomes protected by being framed as neutral. I think this is what Nelson Flores writes about when he refers to hegemonic whiteness. So I'm feeling that as an applied linguist, it's really crucial that I confront with really open eyes the many ways in which applied linguistics can function as a vehicle for white supremacy and relatedly empire. And of course, you know, our participation in white supremacy may be unintended, but our intentions matter less than the material effects of our practice, right? So in the article, I go over a few examples of this complicity between applied linguistics and white supremacy. So I'll mention a couple quickly. One example is just the way we've been socialized to allow language to stand in for race in our classrooms and in our research, so that racial content looks racially neutral. For instance, allowing English to stand in for whiteness, allowing discourses of culture to stand in for discourses of race. So Ina Lee's work is really helpful in this way. She has a study of Canadian ESL classrooms and that shows us how language professionals can make curricular and pedagogical decisions that result in students being pressed towards inevitable performances of Asian otherness. Another example is the way we spend our energies trying to understand, you know, what's the best way to teach language? What's the best way to learn language? For instance, successful acquisition of English, without regard for the constellation of social and political and economic factors that produce desires for English and for whiteness, and the material consequences of those desires for the English teaching industry globally. So how does this feed hegemonic whiteness? How does this feed the global power of English? How does this keep economic power for teacher training in the pockets of white dominant countries? Jamie Schissel's new book gives us more examples of the appalling racial consequences of the language testing industry. Of course, Uju's work that highlights the structural and institutional exclusion of African Americans from world languages study. You all know the Speak, the Versant, the TOEFL tests, the influence they exert in the lives of ITAs. So I ended up at this question: if our discipline is tenaciously enmeshed with and even promotes white supremacy and empire, the question facing us today is whether applied linguistics can ever be sort of disentangled from and even actually work against white supremacy and empire. And then in the article, I focused in on each of those two terms, anti-racist and decolonizing, which are really two different entry points into the same conversation. But you know, they're inseparable from each other as we keep in mind that it's empire that produced and continues to produce formations of race. So to talk about an anti-racist applied linguistics, I turn to several theorists, and the one I'll quote today is Ibram X. Kendi. There's much that we could say about Kendi's work, but he offers this one simple concept that I find has been very accessible and super helpful to a really broad audience, even to folks who've barely thought about race. And that is that there's no such thing as a move that might be deemed racially neutral. He tells us that, and this is a quote, the opposite of racist isn't not racist. It is anti-racist. One either allows racial inequalities to persevere as a racist or confronts racial inequalities as an anti-racist. There's no in-between safe space of not racist. The claim of not racist neutrality is a mask for racism. So we can never say, you know, oh, that interaction wasn't about race, or my research has nothing to do with race, because every interaction, every word, every glance, every moment of our lives is structured by the racial and other power relations we're embedded in. And every time we try to assert racial neutrality, we are in fact promoting racism. So that's really important, right, for applied linguistics to be able to look out for the workings of neutrality hiding in our practice. And then I wrote about the notion of a decolonizing applied linguistics. And now his article describes beautifully the importance of remembering and reviving pre-contact and Indigenous ways of knowing and being. So in that section, I draw on examples of how we as applied linguists can work with systems of belonging and language-based affiliation in ways that conceal histories of white settler appropriation and land dispossession. Checking my time. I also move on to the question of the demographics of the profession and what we can do to alter the underrepresentation of racially minoritized scholars within the field, and specifically scholars who are able to offer critical racial analyses of the discipline within the field in general, and particularly within the leadership of our discipline and our organization. So Uju and Anawa's wonderful projects, they really answer the title question for us, right? The answer is yes, right? And anti-racist and decolonizing applied linguistics is possible. But it's not that straightforward. While an anti-racist and decolonizing applied linguistics is possible, it's not the natural progression of our profession. It's not inevitable. It's going to take a lot of uphill struggling, and it's exhausting. It's a lot easier with allies. So here's some steps that we can take together. Every move we make, let's ask ourselves, is it racist or anti-racist? Opening our eyes to the knowledge that there is no space that is racially neutral. Let's grapple with those difficult questions of what an applied linguistics would look like that didn't rely on colonialism, on empire, on white settler colonialism, on property law, on capitalism. Let's continue to support each other in altering our epistemological practices to actually change what comes to count as knowledge generation. Let's ask ourselves, can we truly be effective applied linguists if we're not willing to consider the ways in which our work is complicit with white supremacy and empire? Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks also for these calls to action and these steps that we can take. We have so far 6 questions, and we'll see if if you have more, please add them, and please upvote so we know that that's the question you want asked or answered before we have to end this session. Our current upvoted, oh my gosh, wait, I had a technological moment you couldn't see. Okay. I'm going to go with the highest voted question to start, which was for Uju. If you could comment on racism among people of color, the anti-Black racism among Asian Americans, for instance, which impacts Black students learning Asian languages and their study abroad experiences in host countries.
Thank you, Ryuko, for the question. anti-Blackness is a global plague. So it's not just something that resides in the US or a concern that we exclusively have. Those African Americans here, and of course, Asian Americans and those of us all here. So that's why we have these struggles, for example, when Black students go abroad as well. So those of us, all of us who are living in this racist society and trying to kind of swim against this current that's taking us, right? We recognize that the anti-Blackness that comes from minoritized populations, because Asian Americans are minoritized as well here in the United States. And the anti-Blackness that were to come from them is also, it lives in being pitted against one another, right? So I look at it in not exclusively the attitudes or the individual actions of Asian Americans. I look at it, for example, in the way society props up Asian Americans, for example, as a model minority that are doing everything right. And we also know that in any kind of stereotype, we live in comparison to others. So the stereotype of the model minority is a declaration that they're doing something right in comparison to those who are not the model minority. And in this country, that would be African Americans, that would be Black people here. So I'm less inclined to examine anti-Blackness coming from Asian Americans, which there definitely is. I am more inclined to look at how Blacks get positioned in comparison to Asian Americans as being deficit in many ways. And those who aren't getting it right, for example, and how can somebody be doing it so right and you are failing? Look how well they're doing, for example, in school or in being enterprising or whatever other stereotypes that we attach to this particular identity. So that is the case that I see here in the US, is having to dismantle this notion that we have, the good people of color and the not so good ones, and which is very real and very true in our field as well, in world languages and applied linguistics, et cetera. I've had experiences where I had to have a conversation, for example, with a professor that I was talking to about African Americans in school. And he said to me, well, isn't it just a cultural problem that it seems that Black people don't value education, like, for example, Asians who we see. And I was taken aback in that, people who literally were killed for learning how to read and had to surreptitiously sacrifice so much to be able to access literacy and education. How in the world can anyone say that they don't come from a culture that values learning and education? So that is a big concern of mine, is the pitting against, in addition to the recognized problems, for example, that African Americans will have when they go abroad to Asian countries that are that exhibit tremendous anti-Blackness there as well.
Thank you. Oh, the upvoting's changing everything. Thank you, everyone, for keeping me on my toes. To what extent can work in new materialism advance in anti-racist decolonizing applied linguistics? Sue?
Oh, I think I might need to let somebody else answer that question. Does anyone else want to chime in?
Oh, good. Now we have comments. I guess I could try to unmute Bonnie. I wonder, that's a lot of tech. Hold on, peoples. Okay, Bonnie, you can talk.
Hi, thank you very much. And just to say thank you so much to everybody for this amazing event. I guess I'm interested in the question of new materialism because it's another series of knowledge building in the field of applied linguistics. So the question is, how do we bring together these different traditions? How do they inform the work of applied linguistics? Are we working in silos, or can we mutually inform each other's work, as a community? So that's, I was just thinking, are there others who are working, are these ideas helpful in an anti-racist, decolonial vision for the future? Or are these just two avenues that are complementary but not necessarily mutually informing?
I mean, I think the problem of us being siloed is a significant one. I think that I think part of decolonizing the academy in general is thinking about the way that we're encouraged to stick to a consistent line of research. We're discouraged from branching out. We're encouraged to mix intellectually with people in a particular scholarly community, and not. I mean, there's a way in which it takes a lot of scholarly energy to move too far out of the line of research that you have established for yourself. And there's a way that the academy keeps you from doing that. So I would say that I think that that's a challenge that we have, and it's certainly one that we need to address.
Well, perhaps just to follow up on Onawa's metaphor of the circle versus the horseshoe, this is going to apply to us as a field as well. And I just wanted to thank her very much for helping us to think and reframe the way we move forward.
Thanks, Bonnie. I'll just maybe quickly add, the field of Indigenous language revitalization, although I positioned it as a distinct field in relationship to applied linguistics, the field of Indigenous language revitalization itself is necessarily interdisciplinary. And so we've been working within that realm, and I didn't talk at all about linguistics as another field. And so I think Bonnie's question is excellent and necessary, and it's an emphatic yes from me. And that's what I'm arguing for. And like Sue said, we work in institutions that I think struggle with interdisciplinarity. That's what I see in the places that I've been. They struggle with, they thrive on the structures that silo because it's easier to administer. But when you want to do interdisciplinary work, they go, that's messy and hard. But then we just have to do the messy and hard. That's okay. We can do that. Excellent.
And I would just add that Angel Lynn is commenting that her colleagues at SFU are doing work that brings together new materiality theories with social justice work.
Thank you.
Thanks. So many screens, but this is amazing. I'm enjoying the features. So I don't know if we can tackle this one, but the next one that's been upvoted is if we can agree that racism is bad and that one is either racist or anti-racist, what do we do about the overwhelming number of racist scholars and professors, and whether the tenure system is preventing us from getting racist professors fired or effectively upholding white supremacy? That moved as I was speaking. Does anyone want to tackle that?
I'm up for tenure, so you ain't gonna hear nothing from me.
Maybe I'll let that one go as a comment and go to Rioko's other, I almost spoke Spanish for some reason, question. If you could comment on, oh, we did that one. Oh, everything got upvoted, and now I'm all confused. The best moderator ever. Okay. Okay, so now we're on this question. If I have a question for all panelists in regards to language making practices in applied linguistics, I think decolonizing in applied linguistics also requires a change in our knowledge making and gatekeeping practices. For example, journal. For instance, to what extent is a blind peer review practice anti-racist or decolonial? Or how could we decolonize the way we keep and produce our knowledge?
I can start and then maybe the others can jump in. But I think that many of our practices are simultaneously colonizing and decolonizing, so that there are ways in which our what we do with journals can be both and neither. So I'll let the others, I've talked a lot, I'll let the others jump in.
If you will allow me to walk back for a second to Kelly's question about is tenure preventing us from getting racist professors fired? Yes. I had a tongue-in-cheek response to that in that, but that is to demonstrate the not so laughable matter of the real and palpable fear that those of us who would speak up against racism among our colleagues and write about it and talk about white supremacy in this system that we are all participating in. I don't absolve myself from participating in racist institutions and white supremacist fields. That's the air we breathe. So it's, I joke I laugh when I want to cry. And it is a tragedy that because I'm terrified of potential letter writers coming for me, I'm terrified of my actual colleagues who are on promotion and tenure committees that will have a say in not just my career, but my very livelihood and ability to feed my children. Because of how they rank me and rate me and my fitness to do this work. So that is how those who have the power through tenure, the power of the permanence of their position, maintain the systems. And those of us who are trying to survive with the system are forced to be complicit in it with silence, for example, and waiting until you advance to be able to spill the tea, so to speak, and bring out your receipts. But then you're still waiting to make full, you're still waiting to make an associate, et cetera. When will you actually be able to talk? So my joke really was my response in the sense that it's difficult to tackle this when it's so entrenched in how we exist and we advance in this field.
Marta, I can respond to these two questions. I'll go back to the one around knowledge making, which I think is a really interesting question. I have a couple of thoughts about that. One is, this system of blind review. I think we all understand why it's there, and it's ironic in a way because it's there to try to protect the thing that I think that the question asker is questioning. But if we accept that a lot of if we call it gatekeeping, or the people who are in control of the majority of journals are of majority status, then it does bring to question the blind review process, because who is reviewing whose work? So the two comments that I have on that is that my own experience of this, I'm doing a special issue journal right now where I'm editing, and we're basically taking a mentorship approach because it's largely emerging Indigenous scholars who we have targeted for the issue. And it's about demystifying the process and offering mentorship rather than a competitive process, like you're in or you're out, or you're good enough or you're not good enough. But if it's about knowledge creation and sharing the kind of knowledge that hopefully you all have enjoyed from my paper and wanting to see more of that, then we need to nurture these young and emerging minds and not just say you're in or you're out. But if we do maintain a pure blind review process like we do in some journals, then I would argue that we need to also diversify our pool of reviewers. So I often have the experience where my papers are blind reviewed, but I can feel and read and see the cultural background of the people who are reading my papers, although they're anonymized to me. They are apparent to me, if that makes sense. On the question about the tenure and promotion system, Dr. Anya's comments are wonderful. Having just gone through that process over the last couple of years, I guess I'm a person who has kind of an epistemology of hope, is that it just to remind us that those systems are made up of people. So just as it can be awful, it can also change because policies are created by people. Tenure is a committee of people. And so at least in our institution, and I'd be happy to talk with you, Dr. Anya, or anybody else offline about some of the progress I think that we've made on that, is that it's absolutely possible to change. Firing tenured professors, I think, is a separate topic, but making kinder, more equitable processes for people going through tenure, people of color, racialized minorities, Indigenous people, I think is something that is definitely within our power and is something that we can work on together right now.
Yeah. Anyway, I might add something else in terms of what organizations like AAAL can do. I think that we're also working to educate others as to what we value. So for example, in the revised guidelines for tenure and promotion, AAAL also has statements that relate to valuing the scholarship of engagement that allows to bring more, folks into the conversation that are doing work that may not be the work that has been traditionally done within applied linguistics, but is very important because, as some of the panelists have already said, we need to be able to to make our work accessible. It doesn't, serve us any good if we only can talk to one another, but if we cannot influence society. So places like AAAL, organizations that are here to provide some guidelines to educate our colleagues at our respective institution, play a significant role in dealing with all of those challenges.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. I don't know if there's one that the panelists see that they really want to tackle before we go.
I just want to say that thinking about the blind review system, that the reason I'm thinking that the only reason that we have the blind review system is because people are hesitant to give it's to give people permission to give negative feedback, right, in a way that so and I think that's it's a valuable skill to learn as faculty members, is to have those conversations. So yeah, I'd just say I'd agree that that it is colonizing.
Okay, so I think for closing, I'd like to talk a little bit more about attracting students from more varied backgrounds and maybe what you've been doing in your own institutions to apply what you're telling us and what we're trying to do, where you've been successful.
I have a really simple answer to that. And we've been doing it for 5 years, which is that you have to convince your department or stage a protest, sleep in, whatever, to prioritize all of your now and future hires, Indigenous and people of color. So you can't do anything about the people that are already there. But this question of, is it programs that attract students? It's usually people. They're attracted by the people who are in your department. That's who's going to bring them in. So make some policy decisions and prioritize the hires, the spaces that you have. You have the power to change the fabric of your department by prioritizing changing the people who are coming in.
I do the work, not just in the work, the research and the writing, but in the daily practice of recruiting and mentoring Black scholars. So I currently have 3 doctoral students who are Black, and that I'm working essentially tripling the Black population of my immediate unit. Through the entry of these students. And they talk to me about the difficulties that they see. And I don't just invite them to come in. I try to make sure that there's money for them and there's support for them to do the work that they want to do. And I do not encourage any graduate student, talk less of African-American graduate student, to take up graduate study without funding. So just the material support that they need to survive. I try whatever power I have to apply for scholarships for them, et cetera. And the everyday human support and well-being that they, and zealousness for their well-being that they need as human beings. I try to provide as well for these students and pull them in the work that I'm doing, so we can all tackle this issue of the broken pipeline together. And so doing the work that I want to see and training the scholars who I want to see participate in our field.
Yes, the same. So both recruiting and retaining, looking at the admission system very critically. We did away with GRE scores some time ago and didn't take them. So we take a very holistic approach to our admissions. So meeting candidates ahead of time, if possible, meeting them on their own in their own spaces, if that's what is easier for them. Doing what we can to get funding for them, helping them to find outside funding if our institution can't provide it. Yes, those kinds of things.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone. That's our time for today, and we thank you all for being part of this conversation and to keep it going when the webinar's over and then in our future events that we have scheduled in the coming weeks. Thanks, everybody.